on the 4th day of June, 1943. The evening air along Railroad Street in Mexia, Texas hung thick with summer heat. The train ground to a halt in a slow metallic sigh, its wheels screaming softly against the rails. Inside the dim Pullman cars, hundreds of German prisoners pressed their faces to the glass, expecting to see a dark, desolate land scarred by war. What greeted them instead stole their breath away. Every farmhouse that dotted the horizon glowed with electric light. Neon signs shimmered above quiet shops. Street lamps lined the road in both directions, stretching farther than their eyes could follow. It was impossible. Back in Germany, blackouts had smothered the nights since 1940. Even in Berlin, no one dared light a candle past dusk. Yet here, deep in the heart of Texas, the night shone as bright as noon. Oberfeldwebel Heinrich Müller, once proud and unbending, stood frozen beside the window. He had believed every word of the Reich's propaganda. America was said to be weak, corrupt, collapsing under its own indulgence. But as he looked out at a land where electricity seemed to flow like water, something in him began to crack. He turned to the soldier beside him and whispered, "If this is what they call decay, I wonder what they call strength." The other man said nothing. His eyes were fixed on the endless sea of lights sliding past as the train slowed into the station. Outside, the people of Mexia had gathered. They didn't shout. They didn't mock. They simply stood and watched, curious, calm, and quietly certain of who they were. The prisoners, expecting scorn or hatred, found none. What they saw instead was composure, discipline, confidence, a different kind of power. The guards ordered them out, row by row. The wooden platform creaked under the weight of 1,800 captured men. The prisoners looked around in disbelief. The station was spotless. Electric bulbs glowed steadily overhead. A clock on the wall ticked with perfect precision. There were no barking dogs, no shouting officers, no fear. Even the guards spoke to each other casually, as if this entire operation was routine. In that moment, the first fracture formed in the wall of belief that Nazi propaganda had built inside their minds. They had been told America was a nation on the verge of collapse. But Mexia, Texas, did not look like collapse. It looked like stability, organized, efficient, alive. For the first time, doubt replaced certainty. As the last of the men stepped down from the train, the sun disappeared behind the Texas plains, leaving a horizon painted in deep amber. A young corporal, barely 20, turned to look back. The rail yard stretched endlessly, lined with locomotives and freight cars that gleamed under the fading light. America was not a land of scarcity. It was a machine that never slept. Later that night, locked inside their quarters, one of the prisoners opened a small worn notebook and wrote beneath the hum of a single electric bulb, "We have arrived in a country where light never dies." If the Führer could see this, he would understand that we have already lost. The memory of capture still burned behind their eyes. Only a few weeks earlier, they had been soldiers of the proud Afrika Korps men, who had marched across the burning sands of Libya and Tunisia under a merciless sun, carrying with them the illusion of invincibility. They had believed themselves part of an unstoppable machine, a force destined to dominate the desert and beyond. But by the month of May, in the year 1943, that machine had shattered, surrounded on all sides, cut off from supplies, starved and bombed into submission. They had surrendered in waves, 250,000 German and Italian soldiers reduced from conquerors to captives. For the first time since the war began, they were no longer advancing. They were being processed, catalogued, and numbered like components on an assembly line. At the port city of Oran, in Algeria, the Americans handled tens of thousands of prisoners each day. There was no shouting, no brutality, no chaos. Everything moved with mechanical precision. The men who had once taken pride in Prussian order stood silently, watching an army that operated with even greater discipline. Identity cards were photographed and filed. Medical examinations were conducted with spotless instruments. Inoculations were given, and the rules of the Geneva Convention were read aloud in fluent German by officers who had been trained for this exact moment. The guards did not curse them or mock them. They treated them not as beasts, but as men. For soldiers raised to believe that mercy was weakness, this calm efficiency without cruelty was deeply unsettling. The first real shock came at mealtime. White bread, real coffee, meat twice a day. After years of rations measured by the gram, the taste of abundance was almost painful. Obergefreiter Hans Müller, who had survived months in the desert, wrote later, "We thought it was propaganda, a trick to impress us. But the food came every day, and it never stopped." What they could not yet grasp was that this was not exceptional treatment. It was routine. The Americans were not trying to prove anything. They simply lived in a world where plenty was normal. When the order came to board the ships that would carry them across the Atlantic, the prisoners braced themselves for the same filth and cruelty they had known in German transport trains. Instead, they were marched onto Liberty ships, new, clean, immense. The decks gleamed under the sun. Cranes swung above them. Steel winches moved with flawless rhythm. Everything was designed for efficiency. Every bolt and cable placed with purpose. An American guard mentioned casually that these ships were being built at a rate of 3 per day. The Germans laughed in disbelief, assuming it was a lie. None of them yet knew that one such ship, the SS Robert E. Peary, had been built in just 4 days and 15 hours. As the convoy pulled away from the African coast, the prisoners leaned over the rails, staring at the fading outline of the desert. Behind them lay defeat, but ahead waited something far more mysterious. There was no fear among them now, only confusion. If their enemies could feed them like kings, build ships faster than they could imagine, and organize the chaos of war with such effortless calm, what else were they capable of? Below deck, in the dim light of a single bulb, Oberfeldwebel Heinrich Müller closed his eyes and listened to the deep, rhythmic hum of the engines. It was not the sound of victory or surrender. It was the heartbeat of a nation that had mastered motion itself. In that moment, he understood something that no German general had yet admitted. This war would not be won by courage or discipline, but by something infinitely more powerful: production. The Atlantic stretched endlessly before them, a rolling expanse of gray water and cold wind. For most of the German prisoners, it was their first time crossing an ocean. They had no idea what awaited them on the other side. Yet even before reaching America, the voyage itself began dismantling everything they believed about the war. The Liberty ship beneath their feet was the first lesson. It moved steadily through the waves, massive and solid, its steel hull groaning with the rhythm of industry. The guards told them there were more than 2,000 ships like it, each built from hundreds of thousands of parts manufactured in factories scattered across 30 states. The Germans whispered among themselves, "In the Reich, such coordination would have taken years. Here, it seemed routine. Every morning, they were fed with a precision that felt mechanical. Hot coffee, bread, meat, fruit, the same every day, without fail. But it wasn't the abundance that struck them most, it was the waste. American sailors threw away food that German soldiers hadn't seen in months, half-eaten steaks, whole loaves of bread, even milk poured overboard, because it had soured. At first, the prisoners were furious. Then they realized what it meant. The Americans didn't waste to insult them. They wasted because they could. Their supply lines were endless. Their warehouses were full. What Germany rationed, America discarded. That quiet realization was more devastating than any bomb. Feldwebel Kurt Zimmermann wrote in a letter home, years later, they lived in a world without scarcity. For us, every bullet, every loaf, every drop of fuel was counted. For them, it seemed infinite. I watched sailors laugh as they threw food into the sea. I understood then why we would lose. As days passed, the Germans began to notice details they had once considered impossible. The engines that drove the ship, 3 massive diesel cylinders, had been built in different factories hundreds of miles apart, then assembled in a port that had barely existed 2 years earlier. The Americans had created not just machines but entire cities to build them. One officer remembered staring at the radar antenna spinning above the bridge, a technology the Germans had believed was their secret advantage. To see it mounted casually on a cargo vessel was like watching the future reveal itself. At night, the prisoners gathered on deck, staring at the horizon. The convoy stretched farther than they could see dozens of Liberty ships, each carrying thousands of men, weapons, and supplies. The scale was overwhelming. It was no longer a war between armies. They realized it was a war between systems, and the American system was something they had never imagined: vast, tireless, and endlessly creative. When the first gulls appeared overhead, and the faint outline of land emerged through the morning haze, silence fell over the deck. Lieutenant Wilhelm von Steuben, an officer from an old Prussian family, watched the coast with a heaviness he couldn't explain. As our ship approached, he later wrote, I saw cranes moving in perfect rhythm, rather turning, ships docking and leaving. It was then I knew Germany had already lost the war. On the 2nd day of August, in the year 1943, the Liberty convoy slid silently into the Norfolk Naval Base in Virginia, the largest naval port any of the prisoners had ever seen. As the ships drew closer to the docks, the usual hum of conversation faded. Even the American guards stopped speaking. Before them stretched a city made of steel and motion. Giant cranes arched over the water, lifting cargo with mechanical precision. Trains clattered along the piers, their wheels striking in perfect rhythm. Rows upon rows of ships filled every slip, their decks loaded with vehicles, crates, and supplies. It was not a port. It was an organism alive, tireless, and perfectly synchronized. For the German soldiers staring across the bay, it was as if they were witnessing another world. In Hamburg, a single working crane could bring an entire district to life. Here, dozens moved simultaneously. No shouting, no smoke, no chaos. The air smelled of oil and salt, not of war. A corporal from the Ruhr, once a factory mechanic, counted 40 ships in motion, and murmured, each one of these moves more in one day than Hamburg could in a week. No one contradicted him. The sight spoke for itself. When the ships finally docked, the prisoners were led ashore in columns toward waiting trains. On either side of the road stretched parking lots filled with automobiles, civilian cars, hundreds of them, shining in the sun as casually as if they were bicycles. The dock workers walked by in clean uniforms, carrying lunchboxes, their faces calm, their steps unhurried. To men who had spent years under ration cards and shortages, it was incomprehensible. In Germany, a private car was a symbol of privilege, something reserved for officers or party officials. Here, even a laborer could own one. The guards ushered them aboard sleek, silver passenger coaches, not freight wagons, but full Pullman cars with padded seats, dining compartments, and fans on the ceiling. The Germans sat in silence, stunned by the luxury. A sergeant, looking slightly embarrassed, apologized that the air conditioning wasn't working properly. Air conditioning. Most of them had never heard the words before. The prisoners exchanged looks, silent but unified, in a single realization no crumbling nation could afford to treat its enemies this way. This was power quiet, organized, certain of itself. As the train moved west, darkness fell through the windows. The men watched America unfold before them, an endless landscape dotted with light. Town after town glowed like constellations against the night sky. Every street corner was lit, every farmhouse bright, every factory alive, working through the hours. In Germany, the blackout had buried the country in darkness for 3 long years. Here, light was everywhere, steady, effortless, eternal. One prisoner muttered, "If this is what they call war, what does peace look like?" Some tried to explain it away. Perhaps this was only the coastal region. Perhaps propaganda had exaggerated their poverty. But the farther the train rolled, the harder it became to deny. The light followed them across Virginia, through Tennessee, and into Kentucky. Each stop revealed the same pattern order: efficiency, abundance. A railway engineer from Berlin leaned forward as he watched an American crew refill coal and water for the locomotive in less than 30 minutes, a task that would take 2 hours back home. Their tools gleamed. Their machinery worked without hesitation. The men smiled while they labored. By the time the train crossed the Mississippi River, silence had overtaken the compartments. The arrogance of the Reich had drained away, replaced by something closer to awe. They finally understood America's strength was not born from slogans or from blood. It was built from systems, machines, and the belief that everything could work better. For the first time, the soldiers of the Third Reich realized they had been fighting a shadow. The true weapon of the United States was not its army. It was everything else. By the time the train reached Texas, in the late summer of 1943, exhaustion had settled deep into the bones of the men. They expected the end of the line to bring misery, a barren camp ringed with barbed wire, the kind of cruelty they themselves had practiced on captured soldiers. But what they found instead at Camp Hearn overturned every image they had carried of captivity. Beyond the gates stretched rows of tidy wooden barracks laid out in perfect order, each one strung with electric light. There were hot water showers, flush toilets, steam heating, and polished wooden floors that gleamed in the sunlight. The prisoners stepped down from the train in disbelief. For men who had slept for months in sand and dirt, this wasn't a prison. It was civilization. Inside the camp hospital, disbelief gave way to silence. The facility held modern surgical rooms, X-ray machines, and cabinets stocked with medicines that German doctors hadn't seen since before 1941. Among the new arrivals was Lieutenant Colonel Dr. Friedrich Bauer, a field surgeon who had spent years stitching wounds beneath canvas tents in the African desert. Now, under bright electric lights, he watched American nurses sterilize instruments and prepare treatments with a precision that stunned him. When he saw penicillin being used casually on minor infections, he could only stare. In Germany, the drug existed only as rumor, a miracle whispered about in medical circles. Here, It was routine. They use miracles, he wrote later, and not on heroes, but on prisoners. In the kitchens, the wonder continued. The men assigned to cooking duty found themselves surrounded by machinery that felt decades ahead of its time: electric mixers, gas ranges, and dishwashers that seemed to run themselves. When they opened the walk-in refrigerators and felt the shock of cold air, one man laughed out loud, unable to believe what he was seeing. The daily rations included milk, eggs, fresh vegetables, and white bread. It was more food than most German families could dream of. Regulations required the cooks to prepare 10% more than needed to ensure full portions for everyone. The surplus, untouched, had to be discarded. One former hotel chef from Munich wept as he threw away loaves of bread. "We waste what our children haven't seen in years," he whispered. The guards enforced rules with precision, but without malice. Orders were clear. Routines exact. Yet beneath it all lay something utterly foreign to these men: respect. A sergeant even apologized when a shipment of cigarettes arrived late. The prisoners didn't know how to respond. They had been raised to see Americans as crude, undisciplined, incapable of structure without tyranny. Yet here, order reigned without fear, without shouting, without hate. When night came, the camp transformed. Hundreds of barracks glowed under the soft yellow light of electric bulbs. The floodlights from the towers swept gently across the compound. Not as threats, but as silent guardians of order, the men lay in their bunks, staring upward, listening to the faint hum of electricity and the smell of bread drifting from the kitchens. They had been taught to despise this enemy, to believe that America was a land of chaos and corruption. But now, a quiet, dangerous thought crept through the barracks. What if everything they had been told was a lie? That night, Dr. Bauer opened his notebook and wrote one final line before the lights went out. "They have defeated us with electricity, with bread, and with decency." The war was lost long before the guns fell silent. By the autumn of 1943, the war in Europe still burned with fury. But deep inside the American heartland, the German prisoners were about to witness something that would wound them more deeply than defeat: the quiet, relentless machinery of American abundance. Labor shortages had driven the UNI, Hoekleiden it en nee al. Yes, government to send groups of POWs into the fields to help with the harvest. Every morning, trucks rolled out of the camps, engines humming in the dawn, carrying men who had once driven tanks and commanded artillery. Now they were bound for wheat fields and cotton rows beneath the boundless Texas sky. What they saw there dismantled the last remnants of their pride. The fields stretched endlessly, rolling toward the horizon: miles of corn, wheat, and soybeans shimmering in the sunlight. Machines ruled the land. Tractors as large as armored vehicles moved steadily across the plains, each driven by a single man. Giant combines swallowed entire rows of crops in minutes, their blades gleaming like glass under the morning light. The prisoners watched in stunned silence. In Germany, farmers still used horses and hand tools, even before the war. Electricity had reached only a handful of rural homes. Yet here, power lines webbed across the sky, feeding energy to every barn, every pump, every machine. Among the workers was Wilhelm Hoffmann, a former engineer from Dresden. He timed one of the harvesters and began calculating in his notebook. "One man here," he wrote, "does the work of 100. The boy driving the tractor couldn't have been older than 16. When Hoffmann told him how long the same field would take in Germany, the boy grinned and said, "We'll have better ones next year." The simplicity of that answer, the confidence, The expectation of progress cut deeper than any victory speech. Everywhere they looked, the same truth repeated itself: efficiency without fear, discipline without cruelty. Even the field workers, the black laborers, the poor white farmhands ate lunches richer than what German officers had seen in months. Fresh meat, fruit, and cold milk filled their boxes. To men who had been told that Americans were decadent and lazy, this was a revelation. This was warfare, not of conquest, but of creation, a battle fought with engines, steel, and innovation. At a cotton gin near Houston, the prisoners watched a single machine process in 1 hour what their villages in Bavaria or Saxony could not have managed in a month. The roar of machinery filled the air. Cotton poured through metal jaws faster than they could blink. The farmer, wearing dusty overalls and a wide-brimmed hat, spoke to them through an interpreter. He was no officer, no politician, just a man with a tractor, a truck, and a house glowing with electric light. His calmness seemed untouchable, as though the war raging across oceans could never reach him. That night, back in the barracks, the talk was subdued. Some men sat staring at the faint orange glow on the horizon, the light of another small town still alive past midnight. Others lay awake, lost in thought. The empire they had served was built on fear, on willpower, on myth. America's was built on something quieter: electricity, machinery, and imagination. Wilhelm Hoffmann wrote a single line before sleep claimed him. We once believed discipline could conquer chaos. But here, order is born from freedom. They have turned liberty into power. By the time the harvest season ended, no one in those convoys spoke of German victory anymore. The wheat fields had already told them everything they needed to know. By the winter of 1943, the prisoners were introduced to a new kind of battlefield, the American factory. Under the rules of the Geneva Convention, they were not permitted to work directly in war production, but they were assigned to industries that supported it: food processing plants, lumber mills, and supply depots that fed the endless machinery of war. It was there, among the steel and steam, that they came face to face with a power they had never understood before: the silent, relentless precision of American industry. For men raised in a nation ruled by hierarchy and fear, what they saw in those humming assembly lines shattered every certainty they had carried with them. In the state of New Jersey, a group of prisoners worked inside a Campbell's soup factory. Steam hissed from pipes as enormous vats boiled tomatoes. Conveyor belts moved with a rhythm that felt almost alive, carrying cans in endless rows beneath the warm glow of overhead lights. The air was thick with the smell of iron, salt, and cooked vegetables. The most astonishing thing was not the machinery, but who operated it. The factory floor was filled with women and elderly men. The young Americans were away, fighting in Europe and the Pacific. And yet production not only continued, it surpassed pre-war levels. A single worker managed what had once required 50 laborers. She adjusted dials and watched gauges while sipping coffee, speaking to the German prisoners with casual ease, as though the war were a rumor, not a reality. Stabsfeldwebel Ernst Wagner, who had once worked in a German cannery, wrote later, "They don't need armies to win. Their machines fight for them." Farther west, near the great industrial city of Detroit, another group of prisoners unloaded coal at a power plant. From across the river they could see the Ford River Rouge complex, an entire city of glass, iron, and motion, where 100,000 workers built jeeps, airplane engines, and tanks. Freight trains moved in and out without pause. Columns of smoke rose like clockwork, clean and straight, never chaotic. One prisoner, Obergefreiter Franz Kellner stood watching the constant rhythm and said softly, "They have conquered time." The guard who heard him laughed. But Kellner was not joking. What he saw before him was not disorder, not the confusion of human labor, but something closer to pure synchronization. In another camp near the steel-producing centers of Ohio, prisoners watched molten metal pour from furnaces that never cooled. Republic Steel produced 10,000 tons each day, more than the entire Ruhr region of Germany had ever managed in its best year. The heat shimmered in waves that distorted the air. They watched as American workers, men and women, black and white operated cranes, poured metal, and guided machinery in flawless coordination. No officers barked orders. No one shouted or threatened. The lines moved because every worker knew his place and believed in what he was doing. For the first time, the Germans began to understand that America's power was not just mechanical, it was philosophical. Freedom, not obedience, had produced this order. Diversity, not uniformity, had made it strong. What the Reich had called weakness was, in truth, confidence born from trust. The Nazis promised unity through control. The Americans achieved it through cooperation. That night, back in the barracks, Wagner wrote by the flickering light of a bulb, "We believed blood determined strength. We were wrong. True strength comes from imagination, from hands that build, and from hearts that trust. They work without fear because they have nothing to hide. That is why they will win." By the time spring arrived in 1944, none of the men doubted it anymore. The clang of steel, the hum of engines, and the endless convoys rolling out of the factories had replaced ideology with something stronger. A new faith in production itself. For men who had once believed in destiny, it was not just a lesson, it was revelation. By the final month of the year, 1943, the cold air of winter settled softly across Texas. Inside the camps, the prisoners began to feel something they couldn't quite name, a subtle warmth beneath the frost. A change in the rhythm of their captivity. The guards were the same, disciplined, precise, and fair. The rules hadn't changed. Yet there was a strange anticipation in the air. One that puzzled them until the first parcels began to arrive. The boxes came by the hundreds, then the thousands stacked high in the camp offices. Carried by volunteers from nearby towns, each one was wrapped carefully in brown paper, tied with string, and marked in simple handwriting. For the German prisoners, when the guards began to open them, disbelief rippled through the barracks. Inside were cigarettes, chocolate, soap, razors, pencils, and small wooden toys. Some even held notes, written by hand, from the Methodist Church of Hearn. "Merry Christmas from Texas. Peace on earth." For men who had lived for years believing that their enemies wanted only to destroy them. It felt like some kind of trick, but it wasn't propaganda. It was real. The gifts had been gathered by local churches, civic groups, and school children. Ordinary Americans reaching out to the very men who had tried to kill their sons. On the evening before Christmas, the camp loudspeakers came alive with a burst of static. Then, softly, music began to play. The Methodist choir from town had come to sing carols in German. The prisoners crowded quietly behind the wire, staring into the night as the voices of women and children rose through the air, pure and clear, singing Stille Nacht. Some turned away to hide their tears. Others stood motionless, their eyes fixed on the light strung across the fence. Beyond the barbed wire, the Americans were singing for their enemies. No guards shouted. No sermons were given. Only music and the sound of forgiveness. For many, It was the moment their hearts broke open. Oberleutnant Walter Müller, whose brother had died in the bombing of Hamburg, wrote later, "They knew what we were. They knew what we had done. And still, they sang for us. Only a nation utterly sure of its strength could show such mercy." The Christmas dinner that followed was almost impossible to comprehend. Turkey, ham, potatoes, vegetables, fresh bread, pies, and ice cream. The same meal, the guards explained, that American families across the country were eating that night. The prisoners ate slowly, silently. Some smiled. Others prayed. One corporal whispered, "If they can feed prisoners like this, how could we ever have believed they were weak?" In the days that followed, the camp newspapers began to change tone. The editorials written by the prisoners themselves no longer spoke of victory or the fatherland. Instead, they discussed rebuilding, democracy, and life after the war. The American officers who monitored morale took note. The Special Projects Division gave it a name: ideological collapse through exposure. No speeches, no propaganda, just the undeniable evidence of how a free nation lived. Letters smuggled home to Germany described clean barracks, good food, and kindness. Mothers and wives wept as they read them, unable to believe that their sons were being treated with such dignity by their enemies. But for the men who wrote them, the truth had already taken hold. The America they had been told was corrupt and divided had revealed itself as something entirely different, a country whose power came not from cruelty, but from decency, faith, and unshakable confidence. That winter, beneath strings of electric light and the echo of hymns floating over the fences, the German prisoners stopped being soldiers of the Reich. They became something else, witnesses to a kind of power they had never known before. A power that conquered not with fear, but with humanity. By the first months of the year 1945, the war that had begun with thunder, banners, and blind conviction was collapsing into silence. Inside the camps of America, the German prisoners followed the fading news. From bulletin boards, cities in flames, armies retreating, and Hitler's promises of new miracle weapons that never arrived. Yet it wasn't the defeat on the battlefield that finally broke them. It was what they saw within the quiet, methodical order of their captivity. The American re-education programs had expanded. Thousands of men now sat in classrooms learning English, mathematics, economics, and political philosophy. Professors from American universities traveled from state to state, lecturing through interpreters. They spoke not of vengeance or ideology, but of democracy, science, and the duty of free citizens. For men raised under a system that punished thought and rewarded obedience, this freedom to think was intoxicating. The camp library became the true center of this transformation. Soldiers who had once shouted Nazi slogans now lined up patiently to borrow books and newspapers. They read about the United States Constitution, the Bill of Rights, and the industrial revolutions that had shaped a nation built on invention. At night, their barracks turned into debating halls, arguments over freedom of the press, workers' rights, and whether authority could exist without fear. It was, in its quiet way, a revolution, not of weapons, but of minds. Then, in the month of April, 1945, came the revelation that destroyed whatever illusions remained. The Americans began showing film from the liberated concentration camps. The prisoners were assembled in the recreation hall, expecting propaganda. What they saw instead froze them where they stood: piles of corpses, skeletal survivors, the chimneys of crematoria, The pits of ash. The air seemed to vanish from the room. Men who had endured Stalingrad and El Alamein wept openly. Others shouted denial, only to fall silent as the reels turned on. Frame after frame of unbearable truth. One officer whispered, "It cannot be real." The Americans said nothing. They did not accuse. They did not lecture. They simply let the film speak. Days later, letters from home confirmed what they had seen. Friends, wives, and priests wrote of the horror of what had been done in their name. For many, it was the final collapse, not of an army, but of identity. Men who had once marched as the proud soldiers of a 1,000-year Reich now understood that they had been serving murderers. One diary found later contained a single line, "We thought we were defenders of civilization. We were its destroyers." In the following weeks, the atmosphere in the camps changed. Guards no longer had to enforce silence at night. The prisoners spoke softly, humbly, even gratefully. The Americans treated them not as monsters, but as men who would one day rebuild what they had helped to destroy. Vocational courses, expanded engineering, agriculture, civic administration. They learned how to manage factories, rotate crops, and organize communities. For the first time, they were being prepared not for war, but for life. When the announcement came in early May that victory in Europe was complete, there were no cheers, no weeping, only stillness. The men understood what it meant, not just the defeat of Germany, but the death of the illusion they had lived for. And yet, beneath the sorrow, a strange emotion flickered relief. The madness had ended. From its ashes, perhaps something pure could begin. Oberfeldwebel Hans Richter captured it best in a letter to his mother. "They have destroyed us without hatred. They have defeated us without cruelty. They have shown us what strength looks like when it builds instead of kills. The Reich taught us to fear tomorrow. America has taught us how to face it." When the war finally ended in the month of May, in the year 1945, the trains began running once again, this time not toward battlefields, but toward home. The prisoners of war, now numbering in the hundreds of thousands, were repatriated in steady waves. They boarded ships that sailed beneath the very same flags they had once fought against. And yet, as they stood on the decks watching the American shoreline fade into the mist, there was no hatred in their hearts. What they carried back across the Atlantic was something far more enduring than resentment, understanding. They had seen a world that functioned not through fear, but through freedom, a society that thrived because its people believed in it. For many, that revelation was more transformative than victory or defeat itself. Before their departure, the Americans gave them more than farewells. They gave them lessons, vocational courses in farming, engineering, management, and civics filled the final months of captivity. It wasn't indoctrination, it was preparation. They were returning to a Germany bombed to rubble, starved of food and hope. And yet, the Americans treated them as future citizens, not former enemies. The knowledge they carried home would become the scaffolding of a new nation. What the United States had offered them was more than shelter and food. It was a blueprint for rebuilding civilization. When they returned to Germany, the change was unmistakable. These men, once soldiers of the Reich, now spoke a new language, the language of efficiency, productivity, and dignity. Many became engineers, teachers, and public officials. They brought back the ideas of assembly line precision, modern agriculture, and democratic leadership. The so-called Wirtschaftswunder, the German economic miracle, was not born in the marble halls of government. It had begun years earlier in the wooden barracks of Texas. In classrooms, lit by soft electric light, where defeated men learned that progress did not require conquest. 4 decades later, in the year 1985, hundreds of those former German prisoners returned to the land that had reshaped them. They walked freely through the small Texas towns that had once held them behind fences. Camp Hearn was now a museum. The air smelled of grass and oil and memory. Among them was Dr. Hans Voss, once a young officer, now an old man with silver hair and a steady voice. Standing before the crowd of Americans and Germans, he said quietly, "We came here as enemies, filled with arrogance and hate. We left as men who finally understood what civilization means. America showed us that true strength lies not in conquest, but in creation." His words lingered long after he stepped down. That evening, as the lights dimmed in the town auditorium, a film flickered across the screen, grainy black and white footage from the summer of 1943. The trains, the floodlights, the faces of the young men stepping onto Texas soil. When the film ended, there was silence. Then, slowly, applause, Americans and Germans together, united not by victory, but by memory. In the end, the men who had once seen America as the enemy became its witnesses. They learned that real power did not come from weapons or ideology, but from the ability to build, to forgive, and to believe in abundance. What had begun as captivity ended as revelation. The greatest triumph of the war was not written in blood or steel, it was written in transformation. Looking back now, one truth stands clear. The most formidable weapon of the 20th century was not the atomic bomb, nor the tank, nor the fighter plane. It was the idea of freedom and the proof that such an idea could create a world stronger than any empire. This was the day the German prisoners of war realized America's industrial power was unstoppable, and the day they began to understand what freedom could truly build. If you believe history should be remembered not only for its battles, but for its lessons, subscribe to WWII Combat Chronicles. Like this video, and share it with others who seek to understand the human side of war. Every view, every story, keeps history alive so that light may always rise, even from the darkest of times.